Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is the human culture of Yellowstone, yesterday and today. And it will be presented by wildlife biologist Aaron Bott. Aaron, thank you so much for being here today. This looks like a fascinating topic. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I certainly think this is a fascinating topic. I have a deep sentimental attachment to the Yellowstone area. Maybe some of you have visited Yellowstone, perhaps with Natural Habitat Adventures. Yellowstone is a marvelous and wonderful landscape that really means a lot to many people all over the globe, as it should, because it's a World Heritage Site, and it is the world's first national park. Without further ado, I think we're just gonna go ahead and jump into this topic. I've got a lot to cover today, and there's a lot to be said about Yellowstone and its history, particularly its human history. But I'm just gonna be talking about some of the milestones in the last 151 years of Yellowstone National Park's existence. So bear with me as we kind of give this abbreviated overview of what the park has been doing the last century and a half, and hopefully it will pique your interest so that you'll go off and do some of your own research. Like was mentioned, my name is Aaron Bott, and I am a wildlife biologist. I specialize in large carnivores. Specifically, I work as a government biologist working with wolves, but I also have experience working with a host of other animals, particularly in the Yellowstone ecosystem. I worked with the Yellowstone Wolf Project for a number of years. I'm still working with them, actually, researching wolves in the park's interior. I've worked with grizzlies in the Yellowstone ecosystem. I actually grew up just outside of Yellowstone, about 2 miles from the park's border, 5 miles from Grand Teton's border, just south of Yellowstone National Park. My family settled in the Yellowstone area 175 years ago, just about. So we've been around in the area longer than the national park has been around, which I think gives me and my family kind of an interesting perspective on how the park and its policies and its concepts and the idea of a national park has evolved over the decades. But this is a picture of me just as a little boy in the upper left-hand corner there, riding on the southern border of Yellowstone National Park as a kid, excited to be riding horses out there. And I found this photo just the other day to show it to my boy, who is 4 years old and is currently wearing that same hat. And then this is a photo of me many years later working up grizzly bears in the same spot. So kind of a cool opportunity, a really deep sentimental attachment, as I mentioned, to the area. Now, if you haven't been to Yellowstone, or if you're familiar with Yellowstone but don't know all of its details, this is a picture of the area that we call the national park. It is approximately 2.2 million acres, just north of 2.2 million acres, and it's found in northwestern Wyoming. 96% of the state is in northwestern Wyoming. 96% of the national park is in northwestern Wyoming, and 3% is in Montana, and 1% is in Idaho on that left-hand border, that western border. So Yellowstone is uniquely placed because this postage stamp of an ecological wonder borders 3 different states. It's a transboundary national park, which means that the management of this national park can be a little bit interesting and complicated sometimes. You can also see that the park's kind of looking like a postage stamp that's been torn at the edges. Originally, it was just created as an arbitrary reserve, a place where we would protect the geological oddities on the landscape, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But after the park was created several decades later, we began to realize the importance of an ecosystem that ecosystems, a concept that was not known in 1872 when the park was first created, has since become something that we look at and we appreciate, understanding that animals, these organic animated entities on the landscape, do not recognize invisible human-made political boundaries. And since the creation of the park, we now focus on trying to protect not just the park itself, but the ecosystem. Now, this is a really cool quote that comes straight from the National Park Service itself. So in the United States, through the Department of the Interior, we have what is known as the National Park Service. And this is their mission. The National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And this is a pretty remarkable statement. It was written in 1916 when the National Park Service was first created, but the parks are created as a place where people can enjoy themselves, but they can also expect to experience preserved nature. And these are two responsibilities that the Park Service has, which sometimes come into conflict with one another. The Park Service is responsible for creating an environment that is pleasing and pleasurable to people, but they are also responsible for preserving the natural world found within the boundary of that national park. And sometimes human interests, the interests of our pleasures, conflict with the preservation of the natural environment. Nevertheless, I think that this is a really unique mission statement. The National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, those other kind of sister agencies that we have in the United States for the protection of natural resources are considered multiple use agencies, where, for example, in the National Forest, you can harvest timber. So you have the forests for commercial gain as well as for ecological integrity. But in the national parks, we simply preserve the landscape for the sake of nature and so that people can experience nature. Well, as I mentioned, Yellowstone is a large national park. For a long time, it was the largest national park in the lower 48 states. It's now passed by Death Valley National Park, which is about 1 million acres larger than Yellowstone. And there are many larger national parks found in Alaska. But 2.2 million acres is no small area. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, we since have grown to appreciate the importance of an ecosystem, an entire environment that supports diversity of life. And so since the 1970s and into the 1980s, we've begun to appreciate what is called the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is arguably between 12 and 22 million acres, extending not just within the park's boundaries, but outside of the park. And that's this kind of area that I've sketched out here on this map. You can see again, Yellowstone National Park there in the center, but just below it, we've since created Grand Teton National Park in 1950. We've got the Absaroka Range, the Wind River Range, all the way up into the Gallatins. This is really the southernmost portion of what we call the Northern Rocky Mountain Cordillera, this chain of mountains that goes all the way up into the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. Just north of Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake City in Utah there, a pretty remarkable montane barrier really for those who are crossing the Great Plains. Now, I'm going to continue on by first explaining what makes Yellowstone unique, and then after that, we'll talk more about the human history and without further ado, let me explain, in case you're unfamiliar, that Yellowstone is an active volcano. That is why Yellowstone is filled with so many geological oddities, with the geysers and the hot springs. Yellowstone is on top of a large thermal plume of magma that is called a hotspot. There's a handful of hotspots found all over the world. Iceland is just above a hotspot. The Hawaiian Islands are just above a hotspot. But Yellowstone is the largest known continental hotspot, likely the largest continental hotspot on Earth, where over the last 16 million years, this thermal plume, this large chamber of magma that is sitting just a few miles below the Earth's surface, is basically stationary as the continental tectonic plate that makes up North America is slowly shifting and moving through convection currents over this thermal magma plume. So the North American continent is drifting westward slowly over this thermal magma chamber, which occasionally breaks through the surface of the continent and erupts in a tremendous and very violent eruption. And again, over the last 16 million years, we've been able to trace the eruptions of this magma chamber all the way through from basically southern Oregon and northern Nevada across the Snake River Valley that is mostly Idaho. And currently, for the last 2 million years, this magma chamber has resided just over northwestern Wyoming. This hot spot has erupted three major times, I should say, in the last 2 million years. And these eruptions are tremendous. In fact, the eruption that took place 2.1 million years ago in what we call Yellowstone today was 6,000 times, it produced 6,000 times as much material and magma and debris as the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So it is arguably the largest known eruption that we have been able to find record of in the world. 2.1 million years ago, this eruption took place. It took place again 1.3 million years ago, and the largest last eruption was 631,000 years ago. We had about 170,000 years ago another eruption which created the west thumb of Yellowstone's lake. But you can see in the upper left-hand corner just the extent of the geographic range of ashfall across the continent and just how tremendous these eruptions truly are. But as the North American continent has drifted over this hot spot and through events known as orogenies, which basically cause folding within the tectonic plate, we have now a high elevated volcanic plateau. The highest peaks in the northern Rocky Mountain range, which again extend all the way up to the Yukon, are actually found in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, because of the rhyolitic soil, this igneous rock, this volcanic ash that has spread across the landscape, the majority of the Yellowstone Plateau is pretty inhospitable to a lot of varieties of vegetation. 80% of Yellowstone National Park is covered in a forest, a thick coniferous forest, and 80% of that forest is lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine trees grow up tall and straight. They have shallow roots, and they typically do better in tough soil conditions that most other species of trees can't do very well in. And this is important for us to realize because today many of us go to Yellowstone because we want to see some of the last wild animals that range across North America concentrated in the Yellowstone ecosystem. But Yellowstone was not originally created as a preserve for wildlife. It was simply created as a place where people could go and see geologic oddities, bizarre things like Old Faithful shooting over 200 feet into the sky. Now, after the eruptions of Yellowstone and its current location, we had the Ice Age, which took place, and we had several subsequent interglacial periods and glacial maximums, which covered this high elevated plateau. And the subsuing glaciers growing and then receding carved a lot of the wild mountain ranges that we see on Yellowstone's plateau and surrounding it, including the Teton Range and the Wind River Range. And it really wasn't until all of these glaciers began to recede that people began to inhabit what is currently Yellowstone. And many of these Paleo Indians we recognize were the Folsom people, named after the type of tools that they used in their style of spearheads that they used for hunting wildlife across the Yellowstone Plateau. And we've been able to document hundreds of archaeological findings all across Yellowstone for the last 11,000 years. So for at least 11,000 years, people have been living in what is today Yellowstone National Park, subsisting off of the land and utilizing the resources there. This is important because for a long time after the park was created in the 1870s, there was a myth that Native Americans did not inhabit Yellowstone ever because they were superstitious of the hot waters and the geysers. But this is false. For many thousands of years, Indigenous Native American groups have lived and utilized the landscape. In fact, we've found spearheads with blood on them that we've been able to carbon date and identify through DNA. About 9,000 years ago, people were hunting bison and bighorn sheep across the landscape, which is pretty exciting if you think about that. Now, thousands of years later, during the time that Lewis and Clark and Euro-Americans were first arriving on the scene, the continent was broken up into large empires and territories inhabited by various nations and tribes of different Native Americans. And the ones that were living in the Yellowstone area were primarily the Shoshone Indians. In fact, a band of the Shoshone, known as the Sheep Eaters, today more commonly identified as the Mountain People, living on the Eastern Shoshone Indian Reservation in the Wind River area of Wyoming. But the Crow Nation as well were common on the eastern boundary. You also had the Nez Perce and the Bannocks, who would commonly utilize corridors through Yellowstone to get to bison hunting grounds in the Great Plains, then return back to their home territories in central Idaho. And of course, we had the Blackfeet, the Kootenai, and the Salish, and the Coeur d'Alene tribes on the northern boundary as well, all utilizing this landscape for many hundreds of years. Now, before Yellowstone became a national park, as I just mentioned, lots of peoples were utilizing this landscape. But what's important for us to realize is that while the indigenous Native American peoples were inhabiting the landscape, they broke up into different nation states and different tribes, and those tribes were not always consistent on the landscape. Really, in the 1800s, it was the Shoshone peoples who first really pushed their way into Yellowstone National Park and over into the Wind River Range. And we have a really excellent documentation of the Shoshone actually defeating the Crow Indians in the Wind River Range and claiming that as their own territory in the 1860s. So these nations and tribes competing for different resources were always in flux, but primarily the Sheep-Eater band of the Shoshones inhabited what is presently Yellowstone National Park. And they were often referred to as the Sheep-Eaters because they lived off of a prime diet of bighorn sheep. The Shoshone peoples again inhabited this area for a long time with their neighbors, consistently with their neighbors, the Blackfeet to the north, which were considered an enemy to the people. The Shoshone were one of the first peoples that Lewis and Clark encountered as they traversed the continent north of Yellowstone National Park by about 60 miles, going through present-day Livingston, Montana. Sacagawea, their female Native American guide, was a member of the Shoshone tribe. And they inhabited this area all the way up until really Chief Washakie, their last great war chief, who led them in a conquest against the Crow Indians, again, just to the east of Yellowstone National Park, managed to settle and negotiate a reservation agreement with the U.S. Army in what is today the Wind River Indian Reservation. But not as many indigenous peoples were treated as fairly as the Shoshone were, and many others were forced to remove themselves to reservations, or they were defeated in conflict, or they were wiped out by disease as Euro-Americans began to expand their way further westward and set up permanent establishments. As I mentioned, Lewis and Clark were the first great explorers, Euro-American explorers, to officially document what was in the West right after the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s. Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark and an expedition of explorers out to find the headwaters of the Missouri River and hopefully a river connection from along the Missouri River that would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And Lewis and Clark did not actually ever come to Yellowstone, as I just mentioned. They were about 50, 60 miles north of present-day Yellowstone National Park, but they were familiar with the Yellowstone River. And this is what I think a lot of people don't understand, is that Yellowstone is named not after the yellow rocks within the park, dyed primarily from the minerals such as iron and sulfur, but the park was named after the river. The park itself is home to the headwaters of a large major tributary river to the Missouri River, which bleeds into the Missouri River on the Montana and Dakota borders. And the Minotari tribe along the confluence of the Yellowstone River and the Missouri River often referred to the river as the Yellowstone due to yellow sandstone deposits found along the banks of the confluence where these two rivers met up. So Lewis and Clark first officially began to document this river, and on their way back to the States after their exploration of the Pacific Northwest, one of the members of their company, John Coulter, decided that he wanted to remain in the wilderness and go exploring. He wasn't ready to go back to civilization after a 3-year adventure in the woods. He wanted to cut his teeth as a trapper. And so he essentially followed the Yellowstone River, and he didn't keep a journal, so it's difficult for us to know exactly where he went. But in 1807, he was certainly the first Euro-American to explore the Yellowstone region. We're pretty confident that he made it along the Yellowstone Lake. He explored some of the geyser basins in the area. And because of his tall tales that he brought back from this area, rumors began to circulate about a hell found in the wilderness where brimstone and sulfur and boiling water steamed up from vents in the earth. And he built himself basically a reputation of telling tall tales, and Coulter's hell was a myth that was then born. Now, this was the beginning of the American fur trade legacy. So fur trapping had been an important part of the economy of North America for the last couple of hundred years, primarily dominated by the British and the French. But as America was first realizing the extent of its newfound purchase via the Louisiana Purchase, this continent that now belonged to the United States of America, Obviously, there were a lot of indigenous Native American peoples who had no idea that such a purchase had been made and were completely disregarded in that respect. Nevertheless, the American government began to explore its own region, and many people trapped animals, primarily beaver, in the northern Rockies in order to make a living. And during this age of the mountain men, which I've identified here as 1807 to 1845, you had famous characters like Jedediah Smith, mauled by a grizzly bear, later crossed the continent twice through the Mojave Desert and the Great Basin Desert. You also had Hugh Glass, the famous mountain man, recently captured in Hollywood by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie The Revenant, this incredible story of a man being mauled by a bear up in the Dakotas. You also had other tall tale figures such as Jim Bridger, who's pictured here in this slide. Jim Bridger became closely associated with the Yellowstone area. In fact, his tall tales, more than anything else, really persisted in the imagination of the other mountain men and the public, whomever would hear his tales, and they often disregarded them as myth, as too tall to be true. Jim Bridger actually is reputed for naming Jackson Hole after his trapping companion, Davy E. Jackson, in the 1930s. And Osborne Russell was the first Euro-American to travel as a trapper through Yellowstone and actually record his findings in a journal. And that is a priceless document that we have today. You can get online and you can buy a copy of Journal of a Trapper by Osborne Russell. And you can read about what Yellowstone was like in 1830. He gives a pretty good detailed account of the wildlife that he found there. Next, in Yellowstone's evolving human history, we had the permanent establishment of settlements by Euro-Americans, beginning in 1847, first with the Mormon pioneers leaving what was then the boundary of the United States along Illinois and the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, pushing their way into the west, into the frontier. This is when my family came west. That photograph in the upper left-hand corner is actually my family. That's my great-great-great-grandfather who came from Denmark and settled out here just in the Yellowstone ecosystem, set up shop, building boats and flipping them upside down so that they would be the roofs of houses for other settlers who were making their way out west. And as I've already hopefully pressed upon you and helped you understand, as Euro-Americans, many of them from the South, right after the Civil War had ended, people looking for new, more economic stability after the Civil War had ended, people from the South moving up into the West, and then Europeans and immigrants moving from the East into the West began to establish themselves across North America. They continually encountered the Native Americans who had called this area home for thousands of years. And unfortunately, this presentation that I'm giving is not doing justice to the Native American peoples who lived here for so long. But unfortunately, as many of us are aware or ought to be aware, the Native American peoples were systematically removed from their native homelands and were put onto reservations where many of them had to subsist for a long period of time. And many of them still are living today and struggling to get out of poverty, etc. Again, unfortunately, I'm not going to be going into the details of their systematic removal, but I will get into the Nez Perce, which I think will highlight some of the issues of Native American removal in just a moment. So as people began to move further and further westward, really between the 1850s and the 1870s, they began to establish permanent residencies throughout the northern Rocky Mountains. Salt Lake, Bozeman, Helena, etc. These places becoming settled, and rumors and reports of this mysterious and uncharted landscape in the middle of this wilderness began to circulate. Aside from trappers, very few Euro-Americans had actually explored the area, and none of them were official. But people began to realize that perhaps there might be something interesting found on the landscape if we wanted to go out and explore some last wild areas. Perhaps there might be gold, or there might be other commodities that could commercially be bought up and then utilized for economic gain. Many Euro-Americans started to create ideas of how this Yellowstone landscape might be profitable to them in their own commercial endeavors. To begin with, in the 1860s, we had an expedition launched that didn't turn out so well. Some folks from Helena, Montana went down toward the Yellowstone area, and due to inclement weather and reported Indian hostilities, they returned back with bruises and sores and tall tales again of what Yellowstone might have to offer. And it was at this time that entrepreneur Nathan Langford, who is pictured here in the upper right-hand picture, he began to talk with politicians in the Montana area, including Doane and Washburn. Sorry, the name escaped me for a minute. Very prominent political and exploratory figures in the Northern Rocky Mountains in the Montana Territory. And they, in 1870, launched an official expedition of the Yellowstone country. And they traveled through the Yellowstone, following the headwaters down from Helena, Montana, all the way into what we recognize as Yellowstone today, coming across the many geysers, including Old Faithful, that they then wrote up reports of and went back to the cities and celebrated the success of their adventure, which really began to garnish a lot of national attention. It was a year later, after this expedition, that the Hayden expedition was finally launched by the US government. The US government was hearing all these reports of this mysterious wonderland that could be found in the Northern Rocky Mountains in the Montana Territory, and they wanted to know what was actually out there. So they hired explorer and geologist Hayden, with his team of not only explorers and cartographers, but also artists such as Thomas Moran and Henry Jackson, to take photographs of the area. And in 1871, they traveled through what is now Yellowstone National Park. This is actually a picture taken of that expedition in 1871. And the report that they brought back amazed the nation. You had Jackson, who brought with him his groundbreaking technology of photography, which he took pictures of many of the bizarre and alien landscapes in order to prove what the expedition was reporting was actually real. And then perhaps even more celebrated than Jackson's photography was Thomas Moran's watercolors. He did many sketches of his findings of the landscape, which absolutely amazed people back home. And he later painted tremendous, huge pictures, huge landscape pictures of the Yellowstone environment, which captivated the public's imagination, including the picture of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which I had at the beginning of my presentation today. And what I think the best thing that could have happened for Yellowstone National Park, as these official government explorations of this territory was taking place, the best thing that could have happened ultimately did happen. The Hayden expedition sent their report back to the US government and said, essentially in a nutshell, this landscape is amazing. It is truly a remarkable place. We don't detect gold in the mountains. They were actually incorrect about that, because there has been gold detected in the mountains since then. But they also recognized that the landscape was not fertile enough for agrarian purposes and seemingly inhospitable to humans, The Hayden Report, along with other political voices in the country, argued that perhaps we should create a national park. This was a brand new idea, not just for the nation, but for the world. A couple years earlier, Yosemite had been set aside as a public park, but because Yosemite is found within California and California already had statehood, Yosemite was actually created as a state park, a state public park, before it became a national park. And the only reason why Yellowstone was not created as a state park, but instead was created as a national park, is because we didn't have any states. We just had Montana Territory, Idaho Territory, and Wyoming Territory. And so in 1872, through the Grant administration, very quietly on May 1st, without any public celebration or really acknowledgement of what just happened, a large tract of land was set aside in northwestern Wyoming territory, and it was the world's first national park. March 1st, 1872, just over 151 years ago. Again, without much fanfare and really an accurate understanding of what had just happened, we created the world's first national park. Oop. So after the park was first created, people really didn't know what to do with it. You can see here's a map of the national park first created in 1872. Pretty arbitrary, really a rectangular box. And the reason why it was created as such is still there was a lot that was unknown on the landscape. The cartographers basically made the best recommendation that they could about how to preserve the geysers and the hot springs that they found to be so charming and enchanting. But after the national park was created in 1872, this just goes to show this story that I'm about to relate goes to show just how wild and untamed and how unsettled the landscape politically still was. Because in 1877, an Indian war actually found its way into Yellowstone National Park. And several early tourists of the park were caught up in this horrific tragedy of America's history. The Ninipu Indians, commonly known as the Nez Perce Indians, from the Wallowa Valley on the Oregon and Idaho border, were being forced to relocate to Oklahoma on a reservation, hundreds of miles away from their homeland where they've been for hundreds of years. And rather than submitting to reservation lifestyle, they decided to flee. And their goal was to try and make it to Canada, where they hoped to meet up with Sitting Bull and several other prominent indigenous leaders of neighboring tribes that they hoped would welcome them into their I'm forgetting the word there, into their group of tribes trying to compete with the American government for land. One of the most celebrated leaders of the Nez Perce was Chief Joseph. He was popularized even in his day as the brilliant tactician that outwitted the U.S. Army for months as they fled across the western lands to try and get to Canada before the military could catch up to them. Chief Joseph was one of many of the chiefs of the Nez Perce, however, that was really responsible for this mass exodus. And in 1877, the Nez Perce entered what is present day West Yellowstone, and they fled through the park, pursued by General Howard, and ultimately escaped on the eastern boundary in the Absaroka Range, only to be captured from the Canadian border by about 40 miles. Again, a really horrific tragedy in American history, and the people were relocated forcibly to Oklahoma on a reservation. But this just goes to show how how unsettled the American West was. We had a national park that was 5 years old when we had an Indian war that was taking place in the backcountry, and tourists again were involved in this. Um, it really wasn't until the 1880s that things began to change, and not necessarily for the better. A lot of political power was put into play to protect Yellowstone National Park because of the railroad companies, specifically the Pacific Northern Railroad, the Northern Pacific Railroad from St. Paul, Minnesota, moving its way out towards Seattle, had a lot of invested interest in creating Yellowstone National Park as a tourist destination, which would help increase the funding for the railroad as it moved its way back and forth across the Pacific Northwest. And at the same time, the story of Alice in Wonderland had just been published, and the railroad seized the idea of Alice and her adventures in Wonderland as perhaps a theme that they could use to capitalize on. And they began to market Alice's new adventures in Wonderland, and Yellowstone became this wonderland that people could go and explore. And through the 1880s, the 1890s, and into the turn of the century, people really pushed hard to market Yellowstone as a bizarre location, a wonderland that people could come and enjoy. And for the first few decades, it was really only the elite that could come out and appreciate Yellowstone. And there was a lot of vandalism that took place at this time because there was no law enforcement to protect the natural resources. A lot of hucksters, a lot of businesses were opening up to capitalize on what was happening in Yellowstone. Different railroads were competing for access to the park. In 1908, the Union Pacific pushed its way up from Salt Lake City into West Yellowstone. And as more and more people came to visit Yellowstone, more and more public attention was given to the landscape. And it became a part of the marketing campaign of the railroad to advertise to people to come and visit America, come and visit your homeland. Don't travel abroad, don't go to Europe. Instead, Europeans, you ought to be coming here. Americans, you ought to be exploring your own backyards and appreciating what we have. Now, this is where the park really began to change in its management. And we have this push in the early beginnings of Yellowstone where the national park was celebrated as a place for the people. And this was not always conducive for the environment and the natural preservation of its location. You might remember that I said that the National Park Service was created in 1916, but Yellowstone National Park was created as the world's first national park in 1872. So for almost 50 years, there was no National Park Service to manage the national park. And because of that, there was a lot of lawless behavior that was taking place across Yellowstone. When the park was first created, hunting within the park was still permissible. And much to the detriment of biodiversity in the area, market hunting was still in full swing during this day and age. So market hunting took place really after the Civil War, where a lot of people began to shoot wildlife for their hides or just for the pleasure of it, or just to capitalize off of different body parts of animals in order to make a quick buck. Since then, we've created different laws such as the Lacey Act, which protect wildlife from market hunting. But when Yellowstone was first a national park, there were a lot of hunters who were coming in and were really doing awful things, killing wildlife left and right. The Bottler brothers were two brothers notorious in the area. They lived just north of Yellowstone, and they boasted of killing 4,000 elk in one summer in Yellowstone National Park. And once we began to realize that Yellowstone ought not to be a place where hunting, especially market hunting, was allowed, we then began to have to focus on managing poaching. Again, without law enforcement, and with it being a very rural part of the United States, a very lawless part of the United States, poaching still persisted within the park. This is an image of Henry Yount, who was hired as the first game warden for Yellowstone. And he was one man who was charged with, on horseback, to year-round patrol all of Yellowstone and to stop people from breaking the law. And as you can imagine, that was an impossible task for one man, and it was not a successful endeavor. So finally, it was proposed that the U.S. Army be in charge of patrolling Yellowstone National Park, that the park itself should be handed over to the War Department, and the Army would manage and protect the resources in Yellowstone. And from 1886 to 1918, the U.S. Army did just that. They managed and protected Yellowstone National Park, busting even Ed Howell, the last bison poacher in Yellowstone. This is a picture of heads taken, confiscated from Ed Howell and others who had been poaching the last of the bison that were found in Yellowstone. Yellowstone is celebrated because of its bison herds, but only about 12 bison, or excuse me, 24 bison were left by the time the Army stepped in and were able to apprehend and forcibly remove illegal behavior from within the park. So once we began to enforce the law and protect the park and deter people from vandalizing the resources found within the park, Teddy Roosevelt, seen here riding in on horseback from Montana to visit Yellowstone in 1903, he dedicated what is now known as the Roosevelt Arch, pictured here, which you'll drive through when you go to Yellowstone today if you enter from the north. Yellowstone is for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. This was kind of the theme of that day and age. And because of that, things within the park really had to evolve quickly. What had been monopolized by the railroads for many decades took a sudden shift when the public began to purchase automobiles. And in 1915, the first automobiles were allowed in Yellowstone National Park. Prior to this, if you wanted to visit Yellowstone, you had to do it on horseback or by stagecoach. And interestingly enough, the last stagecoach robbery in Yellowstone took place in 1914. So yeah, still very much a wild Western scene. But in 1915, the roads were opened up as dirt roads for automobiles. And to accommodate Yellowstone National Park's growing public interest, as well as the growth of other national parks across the U.S., the National Park Service was created in 1916. And in this picture in the upper left-hand corner, you've got Stephen Mather, who was self-employed as the first director of the National Park Service. He paid his own salary and had this incredible, really remarkable vision about what Yellowstone and the national parks ought to become. And his protege, Horace Albright, is standing there next to him. He really was second in command of the National Park Service for many years before he actually became the superintendent of Yellowstone for many years afterwards. Here's another picture of Horace Albright, a really remarkable man. If you ever get the opportunity, I highly recommend that you watch the Ken Burns documentary on the national parks. Horace Albright is a tremendous figure in the national park story. But this just goes to show that people didn't really appreciate or understand the ecological integrity or the biodiversity that was affiliated with Yellowstone's ecosystem and other national parks. Between 1915 and the 1930s, the U.S. Bureau of Biological Survey began to focus on a predator eradication program all across the United States, and this included the national parks. You've got a park ranger pictured here above shooting one of the last wolves in Yellowstone. Grizzly bears were targeted, mountain lions were completely eradicated, coyotes were targeted, wolves were completely eradicated from Yellowstone by 1926. by the Park Service as a part of a government mandate to eradicate predators from the landscape. But not all the bears were targeted. Horace Albright had a soft spot for bears, and the people liked bears too. And so they would habituate bears to eating garbage and to eating human refuse, which obviously is not a good idea, but that's what we've got going on here. When the park hit its 50th anniversary, we began to recognize too that perhaps we ought to have created a national park that was actually larger, that the national park that we had made in 1872 didn't adequately hold enough space for the ecosystem, even though we didn't recognize that it was an ecosystem. So we began to kind of change the boundaries of Yellowstone, and we included different watersheds. We expounded it in the Northwest and in the Northeast, and we had to trade some lands to the National Forest Service in the Southeast. But Yellowstone continued to evolve and to grow. And this was, again, a time of management for the people. There was a lot of artificial management of Yellowstone. And this is very bizarre because people who don't understand this, that this is how things operated and things have changed, they would be justified in being confused, because now we go to Yellowstone and we appreciate the natural environment, this system of preservation. But with the eradication of predators by the Park Service and by the US government and by local agencies, and with the removal of poachers, the herbivores on the landscape began to grow. And the elk, which had once been depleted by poaching and market hunting, now boomed. Without poaching and market hunting and without predators, the elk population got so large that the Park Service had to systematically remove elk. They had to cull elk from northern Yellowstone every year. In fact, over the course of about 2.5 decades, 70,000 elk were removed from Yellowstone National Park to try and keep the population in check. The bison, which had almost completely been eradicated from the park, were now coming back in force after having been augmented by some bison from Montana as well as in Texas. But we began to really appreciate Yellowstone again as a pleasuring ground for the people. And this parody, Jellystone National Park, with Yogi Bear, kind of, I think, summarizes everything into the post-war years, into the 1950s and into the 1960s. Yellowstone National Park was not treated as a place where nature could thrive, but as a public vacationing center where people could get out and appreciate some of the natural wonders that we have in this country without really understanding how to respect or protect those natural resources. So I'm running out of time, so I'm quickly going to hurry through this last chapter that I have here. But natural preservation began to take hold in the 1960s. Biologists and ecologists and researchers who have been observing the natural wonders of Yellowstone as well as elsewhere in the country and in the world began to recognize that we were mismanaging what wonderful natural resources we had within Yellowstone National Park. And in 1963, Starker Leopold, pictured here in the upper right-hand corner, the son of famous foremost wildlife management biologist Aldo Leopold, co-wrote what became known as the Leopold Report. This argument that the National Park Service ought to be managed more naturally. And this was published in 1963. And one of the things they targeted was mismanagement of the bears. Handouts, for example, letting bears feed at garbage dumps. The eradication of predators on the landscape was condemned. And it was argued that we ought to be working harder to try and restore a natural balance to the environment in order to help the biological integrity of these national parks. And then in the 1960s into the 1970s, the Craigheads, John and Frank Craighead, twin brothers out of the Yellowstone area, did groundbreaking research by really basically inventing radiotelemetry to monitor and manage wildlife, and doing one of the most intensive research projects on grizzly bears, pioneering research on grizzly bears in Yellowstone. And this is a grizzly bear, by the way, found at one of the dumps of Yellowstone. Public viewing was made possible for people to go out to these public dumps and watch grizzly bears come out of the woods at night, where they would forage on human refuse. And the Craigheads were a part of this research that began to show, you know what, we need to work towards a more natural and healthy way of managing wildlife. And because of the radio telemetry collars that the Craigheads began to put onto wildlife, we first began to realize and appreciate that wildlife moved beyond the national park. And this seems so obvious to us today, but it wasn't until the 1980s that we began to recognize that Yellowstone should be more than just a national park. It's really an ecosystem that extends far beyond the boundaries of Yellowstone itself. And this part of natural regulation really was put to the test in 1988 when a third of Yellowstone National Park burned due to drought and also to mismanagement of the forest for a very long time. But this is when I was born, and I can say today that when you go back to Yellowstone, the forests have all regrown, and it's pretty remarkable to see how nature can handle itself. And this was, again, putting that theory of nature should be left alone in the national parks. It really put this to the test. And as a highlight, wolves, which had been exterminated from the Yellowstone area and from really most of the contiguous United States 70 years before, were heroically reintroduced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service into Yellowstone in 1995 and 1996. And that success story is so great that today you can sign up with Natural Habitat Adventures to specifically go on a wolf watching expedition. So here we are today. I'm wrapping this up. Again, I knew that I would have too much to say, and I apologize for that. But I'll say that we're going on beyond the 150 years that Yellowstone has been around. And we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. One of those challenges is climate change. As the climate is changing, temperatures are rising, and we can expect more problems in this environment. And how are we going to better manage and protect the resources that we have here? That's a growing concern and a question that we're trying to deal with and to come to terms with. Also, the popularity of Yellowstone has grown almost exponentially. Yellowstone National Park gets almost 5 million visitors every year. That, just to put it into perspective, that is more visitors than the combined populations of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Almost twice their combined populations. That's a lot of feet on the ground. That's a lot of resources. How are we gonna exist, or how are we gonna continue to enjoy Yellowstone National Park as we continue to put strain on its resources through visitation? How do we juggle all of that? And also, we have hyper-urban development taking place all around the Yellowstone ecosystem, where places like Jackson Hole and West Yellowstone and Bozeman are growing so quickly that it's rapidly gobbling up the wild spaces the animals and other living things need in order to thrive on the Yellowstone ecosystem. But aside from those large problems, I think it's really important to recognize that Yellowstone today is doing better than it ever has. We don't have the poaching. We don't have the predator eradication. We have more of its natural species today in Yellowstone than we had when it was first created in 1872. The park is thriving because of the hard work of biologists and researchers and concerned public members who are very interested in making sure that Yellowstone is not just here today, but it is also here for future generations, as is mentioned by the mission statement of the National Park Service. I'll conclude with this final slide showing you the legacy of Yellowstone National Park, the world's first national park, and the reputation that it established. Now we have hundreds, if not thousands, of national parks all across the world, thanks to Yellowstone and the legacy that it began. here are some books that I highly recommend. There's a lot of books out there, but if you're interested in learning more and getting into the nitty-gritty, these are all great reads. Specifically, Searching for Yellowstone by Paul Schulery, I think, is a really good synopsis of the park's history. I highly recommend it. Engineering Eden is a phenomenal book based off of bear management. And I could conclude by going to my last slide, but I think I'll leave this one up in case people are interested in checking out those books. I went over an hour. I'm sorry, but thank you again for listening. I've got time to take questions, so I'll turn it back to Nat.
Aaron, that was fabulous. I learned so much about Yellowstone, and I'm so intrigued by your family history. What a unique perspective you have on this whole area. So thank you so much for sharing both your knowledge and your personal story with us. We do have a few questions, so let's just dive in real quickly. A few folks were interested in knowing if there's any interest or opportunity to expand the park boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, that has been a subject actually since the 1870s. General Sheridan, who visited the area, suggested to Congress back in the 1870s that the park be doubled in size. Man, I wish that would have happened, but it didn't. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that Yellowstone will be made bigger. Instead, we have to better learn how to manage the area as an ecosystem instead of just putting all of the conservation burden on the Park Service. So surrounding Yellowstone is Grand Teton National Park, as well as tens of thousands of acres of land managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And all of these agencies, as well as private landowners, need to work hard to preserve this ecosystem.
Has the damage from last year's flood been mostly repaired, or are there still areas that need restoration? Has it been determined what impacts the flood might have on the wildlife?
Well, the impacts the flood had on the wildlife are pretty insignificant, with the exception of perhaps your amphibian and your fish populations. But even those can rebound from that flooding event very quickly. If anything, it was kind of a miracle, in my opinion, because it reduced the amount of human traffic that was expected to come to Yellowstone last year. It was the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone, so we expected a lot of people, but because a large segment of the park was closed, you could say that nature got a reprieve, and I think that that's a pretty cool way to look at it. So the animals really thrived without so much human attention. The roads have been repaired as of last October, and now you'll still see landscape scarring from the flooding, but people can come and go through the park.
Sounds good. What time of year is Yellowstone the least busy, or there's the least amount of traffic from tourism?
Yeah, after the 1960s, snowmobiling and winter recreation really took off in Yellowstone. And so now there is a summer season and a winter season. The winter is definitely quieter, a lot quieter. They're two different animals. I mean, obviously you're not going to see grizzly bears in the winter time because they're all hibernating. But personally, I really enjoy the winter. It's quiet and it's beautiful.
Sounds good. Well, thank you again. That's the last question we have time for today, so I'll turn it back to you for closing comments.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. I'm sorry that I just had so much to say. I just ran out of time. Wish that I could have talked about it longer, but Yellowstone truly is a remarkable place. I hope that at the very least, one thing that you walked away with today is an understanding that the national park system and Yellowstone is not a stagnant museum. It was created in 1872, but there has been a lot of change to its management and its identity since then. And its identity and its management will continue to change and evolve into the future. And it's up to us to appreciate it and to voice our concern for it and our love and our admiration for it, and also hopefully to get out and to appreciate it in person.
Makes me want to plan a trip right now. And I could have listened to you talk for another hour, so maybe we'll have to plan a part 2. I'm not alone. The comments show a similar feeling. Thank everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.